I was in Denver for a client hearing when my husband's number lit up my phone. A stranger answered. Mrs. Mercer, your husband was in a collision. He's at St. Joseph Medical Center. 3 hours later, I stood outside intensive care when a nurse stopped me. I'm sorry, you can't go in. His wife and daughter are already with him. For a second, I thought she had confused the rooms. Then I looked through the glass. Grant Mercer, my husband, lay unconscious beneath white sheets, one side of his face bruised and swollen. Beside him sat a woman I had never seen, holding the hand of a little girl who looked so much like Grant that no DNA test was necessary. She couldn't have been older than 4. Grant's mother stood behind them with both hands on the woman's shoulders, comforting her, like family. I didn't go in. I didn't scream or demand answers. I thanked the nurse, found an empty stairwell, sat on the concrete steps, and called the one person Grant should have prayed I would never call. A private investigator. My name is Claire Mercer. Before I married Grant, I was Claire Donovan, partner at Donovan Pike, a Seattle litigation firm specializing in financial fraud and high-asset divorces. Clients hired me when they believed someone was hiding money. For 12 years, I had followed money through shell companies, offshore accounts, fake agreements, and family trust. People rarely build one enormous lie. They build hundreds of small ones and trust that no one will compare the pieces. Apparently, I had been too busy. Grant and I had been married for 8 years. He was 42, charming, controlled, and founder of Northline Systems, a fast-growing freight tech company. Investors loved him. My parents trusted him. We lived in Queen Anne, shared investments, traveled twice a year, and had dinner with his parents every month. We had talked about children. There was always another funding round, another case, another important quarter. Next year, Grant always said. Apparently, he had started that next year with someone else. The hospital call came at 6:38 p.m. Grant's SUV had been struck at an intersection. Severe head injury. Critical condition. They needed his legal next of kin. I booked the first flight back to Seattle. During the flight, I thought only about keeping him alive. By the time I reached the hospital, it was almost midnight. I showed my ID and hurried toward the ICU. Then the nurse stopped me. When she said his wife and daughter, something inside me went quiet. Because through the glass, I could see more than an affair. I could see a life. The woman leaned over Grant with practiced familiarity. The little girl rested against her hip, clutching a stuffed fox. Grant's father crouched beside the child and whispered something that made her nod. No introductions were happening. No one looked confused. They already knew one another, which meant the betrayal was older, larger, and far more organized than I had imagined. I released the door handle and walked away before anyone inside could see me.
The stairwell smelled like disinfectant and old concrete. A green exit sign buzzed above me. I sat on the 3rd step and stared at my phone for maybe a minute before calling Owen Blake. Owen had spent 18 years investigating financial crimes before opening a private firm. I had used him on difficult cases when someone's finances looked clean because they had been deliberately designed to look clean. He answered immediately. Claire, I need you to find someone. That changed his tone. Who? A woman at St. Joseph Medical Center. ICU, early 30s, auburn hair, gray coat. She has a girl with her, around 4. Connection? I don't know yet. There was silence. Then Owen asked, Grant? Yes. Another pause. What exactly do you want? Everything that can legally be obtained. Name, employment, address, public financial records, property, companies, known connections to Grant. Start with the child. You want paternity? I want confirmation. I'll move. And Owen? Yeah? Grant cannot know. He won't. I ended the call. That was the moment my marriage stopped being a marriage and became a case. People think attorneys react quickly because we enjoy confrontation. Good attorneys don't. We wait. The first person who shows what they know usually gives away the advantage. So I left the hospital. Before leaving, I returned to the reception desk and lowered my voice. I'm sorry, I'm confused about something. I'm listed as Grant Mercer's legal spouse and emergency contact, correct? The nurse checked the computer. Her forehead tightened. You are listed as spouse. And the woman upstairs? Another hesitation. There was an update to his emergency contact information approximately 11 months ago. Can you tell me who changed it? I'm afraid I can't. Of course, I smiled. Thank you. At 6:15 the next morning, I was already in my office. My assistant, Rachel, walked in carrying 2 coffees, looked at me once, and put both on my desk without asking anything. I loved her for that. At 7:03, Owen sent the first report. The woman's name was Natalie Brooks, 31, brand strategist for a luxury skincare company. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Bellevue that cost considerably more than someone on her reported salary should comfortably afford. The lease had been prepaid for 18 months through a company called Ravenstone Consulting, LLC. I recognized the address attached to Ravenstone immediately.
It belonged to a commercial building Northline Systems had used during its first year. The girl was Sophie Brooks, 4 years and 2 months old. No father was listed publicly, but there were photographs. Grant at a Christmas market. Grant pushing Sophie on a swing. Grant standing beside Natalie at a small private birthday party. One photograph had been taken 22 months earlier. Grant was holding Sophie while his mother cut a cake. I stared at that picture longer than all the others. His mother. So this wasn't something his parents had discovered recently. They had participated. 8 years of dinners. 8 years of Sandra Mercer telling me I worked too much. 8 years of Grant's father asking when we planned to give them grandchildren. They already had one. At 9:41, Owen called. You were right. I closed my office door. About Sophie. My hand tightened around the phone. I found a medical document connected to a private insurance policy. Grant is listed as the child's father. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. How old is the policy? 4 years. 4 years. Half my marriage. I opened Grant's financial disclosure folder. Every major asset, every investment, every trust, every business entity I knew existed. Then I created a second folder beside it. I named it Unknown. At 10:26 that morning, the hospital called. Grant was awake, and according to the nurse, he was asking for his wife. I almost laughed. The only question was, which one?
I arrived at the hospital at 12:40. Natalie and Sophie were gone from the room. Grant's parents had stepped downstairs for coffee. I knew because Owen had someone watching the corridor. Grant looked worse awake. His left eye was swollen nearly shut, his head wrapped in white gauze, and there were stitches running from his temple toward his ear. When he saw me, his entire face changed. First surprise, then fear, then calculation, and finally relief. It happened in less than 2 seconds. "Claire," his voice cracked. "You came." "Of course I came." I crossed the room and took his hand. His fingers were cold. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "You almost did." He smiled weakly. For the next 30 minutes, I played the frightened wife. I asked about the surgery, I adjusted his blanket, I told him Rachel had postponed my hearings. I even laughed when he complained about the hospital coffee. Grant relaxed gradually. That was important. A liar under pressure protects himself. A liar who believes the danger has passed starts making mistakes. "I'm sorry you had to fly back," he said. "Don't be ridiculous. You were in Denver for something important." "You're more important." His eyes softened. He believed me. Or he wanted to. I waited another 10 minutes before saying casually, "The police contacted me about the accident." His hand moved slightly. "Already?" "They'll probably want the vehicle data. Insurance, too." "Right. There was a dash camera in the Range Rover, wasn't there?" Grant looked toward the window, only for a second. "Yes." "Do you know where the memory card is?" "I think my phone bag." I reached toward the bedside table. He stopped me. "Actually, I might have removed it." There it was. "Before the accident?" "I don't remember." I gave him my most reassuring smile. "Grant, whatever is on it, I'm your attorney before I'm anyone else. If there's something that could create liability, I should see it before an insurer or investigator does." That wasn't technically true, but it sounded true enough. He stared at me. Then he reached toward a small black belongings bag beside the bed. His hands were shaking. He pulled out a plastic case and gave it to me. "Just make sure nothing gets misunderstood." I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "That's what I do." 40 minutes later, I was sitting in the hospital parking garage with my laptop open. The recording began 17 minutes before impact. Natalie was in the passenger seat. Sophie wasn't with them. Their voices were relaxed, domestic. Grant was complaining about investors. Natalie was talking about preschool applications. Then she laughed. "You promised Sophie we'd all go to Vancouver together." "We will." "When?" "When Claire has one of her long cases." My stomach tightened. Natalie sighed. "I hate doing this." "Doing what?" "Sharing you." Grant laughed softly. "You're not sharing me. I am literally sharing you with your wife." "She's barely a wife." I stopped breathing. Natalie said nothing. Grant continued. "Claire loves work. That's her real marriage. And if she finds out?" "She won't." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." His voice had that confident tone I knew from investor meetings. "She sees what she expects to see." A few seconds passed.
Then Natalie asked quietly, "Do you ever feel guilty?" Grant laughed again.
"About Claire?"
"Yes." "No." The answer came too quickly. "She doesn't need me. She needs someone respectable beside her at dinners and charity events." Another pause. "What about children?" "What about them?" "You told me she wanted them." "She likes the idea of wanting them." Then he said the sentence that ended whatever remained of my marriage. "Sophie is my real family." 6 seconds later, tires screamed. Natalie shouted his name. Metal folded. The recording ended. I sat in the darkness with my hands resting on the keyboard. I replayed that sentence once. Only once. Then I closed the laptop. At 2:08 p.m., I called Northline's CFO. His name was Ethan Cole. Ethan had worked at the company almost from the beginning. He was careful, intelligent, and Grant had humiliated him publicly twice during board meetings. "Claire?" "Ethan, I need a complete copy of Northline's debt structure." Silence. "Why?" "Because Grant may be unable to manage the company for several weeks. And I think there are liabilities he never disclosed to me." A longer silence. Then Ethan said something very interesting. How much do you already know? That was when I realized Grant had not been lying only to me.
Ethan came to my office at 4:30 carrying a laptop and a folder thick enough to make me immediately understand why he had sounded nervous. Grant told the board these were temporary, he said. What are they? Personal guarantees. How much? He hesitated. 14 million. I leaned back. Grant had personally guaranteed $14 million of company debt and had never mentioned it to me. That alone would have been bad. But Ethan kept going. There are also 2 bridge loans tied to Northline's private valuation. If the next funding round fails, certain guarantees accelerate. When? Possibly within 90 days. I opened the folder. Grant had built a financial house with beautiful windows and rotten foundations. And because we were married, some of those foundations reached directly into my assets. Does the board know the full exposure? No. Does Natalie? Ethan looked confused. Who? Never mind. I spent the next 6 hours reviewing every document. By midnight, I had a plan. Not revenge. Protection. That distinction mattered to me, even if nobody else would eventually believe it. The following morning, Grant's neurosurgeon scheduled another procedure. The accident had caused swelling that could worsen without warning. At 8:15, I stood beside Grant's hospital bed, holding a power of attorney package prepared by my estate lawyer, Thomas Reed. This is temporary, I told Grant. He looked exhausted. For the company? For everything necessary while you recover. Payroll, banking, insurance, board matters. You shouldn't be dealing with signatures from a hospital bed. He flipped through the first 2 pages. Grant never read beyond page 2. It was one of those habits I had found almost endearing during our marriage. Now it felt like negligence. Standard? Completely. He signed. At 8:23 a.m., I became legally authorized to manage most of his business affairs while he was medically incapacitated. The next step involved our marital assets. Thomas drafted a supplemental property agreement restructuring exposure connected to Grant's business guarantees. On paper, it separated high-risk corporate liabilities from assets that had always primarily belonged to me. Our Seattle apartment, 2 investment accounts, a commercial property interest inherited from my father. Everything was documented. Everything had legitimate legal reasoning. And everything was timed with absolute precision. Grant signed that agreement the morning before surgery. Again, he barely read it. Then I called Ethan. Send the board the complete financial picture. All of it? All of it. Grant is going to lose his mind. Grant is unconscious. The board met that afternoon. For years, Grant had presented Northline as aggressive but stable. Ethan's report showed something different. Falling margins, delayed contracts, heavy short-term debt, personal guarantees, a funding round far less certain than investors had been told. Nothing was invented. Nothing needed to be. Truth, properly organized, can be more destructive than any lie. By evening, 3 investors had called. 2 lenders requested updated information. Northline's chairman demanded an emergency review. Grant was still recovering from surgery and knew none of it. Meanwhile, Owen continued tracing Natalie's finances. The Bellevue apartment, a leased Mercedes, private preschool tuition, trips to Vancouver, Napa, and Hawaii. All paid through companies connected directly or indirectly to Grant. Over 4 years, he had transferred more than $600,000 into the life he claimed did not exist. But Natalie did not know the worst part. According to Owen, Grant had told her he was separating from me. For almost 3 years. Every delay came with a new explanation. My difficult cases, tax consequences, company financing, a sick relative, bad timing. He had lied to both of us using completely different versions of the same future. So on the 4th day after the accident, I went to the hospital's family lounge. Natalie was sitting alone near the window. Sophie was with Grant's parents. I sat across from her. She looked up. Her face lost all color. You're Claire? Yes. She stood immediately. I can explain. I'm sure you can. I didn't know at first. At first? Her eyes filled with tears. He said you were separated. For 4 years? Natalie looked down. No. I placed a thin folder on the table between us. Inside were copies of the transfers, the apartment payments, the company records, and several photographs Owen had collected. She stared at it without touching it. What is this? Your life with my husband. Her breathing became shallow. I'm not here to scream at you, Natalie. Then why are you here? Because Grant lied to both of us. She looked at me, and for the first time since entering that hospital, I saw something useful in her expression. Doubt.
Natalie finally opened the folder. She read the first page twice, then the second. By the time she reached the payment history, her hands were trembling. He told me Ravenstone was his company. It is connected to him. He said the apartment was already paid for through a corporate housing arrangement. It wasn't. She looked toward the hallway. Sophie thinks he's coming home with us. I said nothing. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Natalie wiped her face. What happens now? That depends on what Grant does when he recovers. And what are you going to do? I'm going to protect myself. She gave a short, bitter laugh. From me? From everyone who knew. That landed. Natalie stared at me. You think his parents knew? I know they knew. Her face changed. Apparently, Grant had lied about that too. He had told her his parents were uncomfortable with the situation, that they tolerated her only because of Sophie. In reality, Sandra had spent years behaving like Sophie's grandmother while sitting across from me at dinner once a month. I almost admired the efficiency of it. Almost. I slid another document across the table. Thomas had prepared it that morning. It offered Natalie a structured settlement covering housing and support for Sophie while Grant remained incapacitated. In exchange, she would disclose all financial transfers she had received and cooperate with the review of several North Line entities through which money had moved. She read slowly. Why would you help us? I'm not helping you. I kept my voice calm. I'm separating facts from liabilities. She looked offended. Good. Offended people read more carefully. Take it to your own attorney, a corporate attorney, not Grant's lawyer, not someone recommended by his parents. She looked surprised. You want me to have a lawyer? I insist. That was the difference between anger and strategy. Anger wants someone trapped. Strategy wants every signature to survive scrutiny later. Natalie left with the documents. 2 days later, her attorney called Thomas. They negotiated for almost 9 hours. By Friday morning, the agreement was signed. Natalie received temporary financial protection for Sophie. In return, we received 4 years of messages, account records, payment confirmations, photographs, and emails Grant had believed would remain private forever. There were 1,846 messages. I read every one. Grant had maintained 2 calendars, 2 sets of anniversaries, 2 versions of himself. With me, he complained about exhaustion and responsibility. With Natalie, he complained about me. He called me cold, ambitious, unavailable. He told her I had refused to have children. That was a lie. The truth was uglier. 3 years earlier, I had suggested we start trying. Grant told me he wasn't ready. At that exact time, Sophie was already 11 months old. At 3:20 Friday afternoon, I was in my office reading a message in which Grant promised Natalie they would finally be a real family by Christmas when Owen called. You should get to the hospital. What happened? Grant had another brain bleed. I was standing before he finished the sentence. When I arrived, the hallway outside intensive care was crowded.
Sandra was crying against Edward's chest. Natalie stood near the wall holding Sophie. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Elaine Foster, spoke carefully. The hemorrhage is significant. We can attempt another operation, but the risks are extremely high. How high? Edward asked. His chances of meaningful recovery are below 30%. Sandra made a sound I had never heard from another human being. Dr. Foster continued. The alternative is comfort-focused care. Everyone looked at me, because Grant's power of attorney gave me medical authority while he was incapacitated. For the first time, Sandra spoke directly to me. Claire, please. I looked at her. This woman had known about Sophie for years. She had hugged me on birthdays. She had asked me when I planned to make her a grandmother, while already buying Christmas presents for another grandchild. And now she wanted me to decide whether her son lived. I could have. Legally, the decision was mine. Instead, I asked Thomas to bring the transfer papers I had prepared that morning. I placed them on the small table between us. I'm transferring the medical decision to his parents. Edward stared at me. Why? Because whatever happens next, I don't want anyone saying I chose it. Sandra signed. Edward signed. I stepped away. They chose the operation. It lasted almost 6 hours. Grant survived. But when Dr. Foster finally came into the waiting room just after midnight, her expression told us survival was not the same thing as winning. Grant Mercer was alive. He could breathe, his heart was strong, but the man who had built 2 lives and believed he could control both of them might never speak again.
For 11 days, Grant remained in intensive care. He opened his eyes occasionally. Sometimes they followed movement. Sometimes they didn't. The neurologists refused to make predictions. Recovery can surprise us, Dr. Foster said. Doctors say things like that when certainty would be cruel. Meanwhile, Northline continued collapsing. The board suspended Grant as CEO pending a financial review. 2 lenders accelerated repayment discussions. A major investor withdrew from the next funding round. Ethan called me every morning at 7 o'clock with updated numbers. By the second week, Northline's estimated position was negative $29 million if all guarantees and outstanding obligations were triggered. Grant's personal exposure represented almost half of it. The assets protected under our supplemental agreement were worth approximately $36 million. For years, Grant had believed he was the wealthy one in our marriage. Technically, he had been. For about 48 hours after signing those papers, he wasn't. Natalie discovered this from her attorney. She called me that evening. What happens to Sophie? She remains Grant's daughter. That's not what I asked. I knew. If Grant's estate becomes insolvent, child support claims will compete with other obligations. Silence. You knew this would happen. I knew Northline was weaker than Grant represented. You destroyed his company. No, I looked through the glass wall of my office at Ethan and 2 forensic accountants working through boxes of records. Grant did that. I simply stopped hiding the numbers. Natalie hung up. 3 days later, Grant's parents requested a meeting. Sandra and Edward came to my office without attorneys. That was their first mistake. Sandra looked 20 years older than she had at the hospital. Edward looked angry enough to compensate for both of them. You have to reverse these agreements, he said. Which agreements? Don't do that. Do what? Talk like I'm one of your clients. You're not my client, Sandra interrupted. Claire, we're asking you as family. I stared at her. The word almost impressed me. Family? She began crying. We were wrong. For how many years? She didn't answer. Edward leaned forward. Grant made mistakes. No, Grant made schedules. His expression tightened.
He maintained 2 homes, 2 financial systems, 2 sets of holidays, and a 4-year-old daughter. That isn't a mistake. That's administration. Sandra whispered, we were trying to protect Sophie. And who was protecting me? Neither answered. I opened a folder. Inside was a promissory note Owen had discovered while tracing Grant's older transactions. 7 years earlier, Edward and Sandra had borrowed $2.4 million using their Mercer Island house as security. Grant had personally guaranteed part of the loan through one of his holding companies. That company was now exposed to Northline's creditors. Edward read the first page and went pale. What does this mean? It means your house may become part of the recovery process. Sandra stared at me. You would take our home? I'm not taking anything. You arranged this. No, Grant arranged it 7 years ago. You signed it. Edward slammed his palm against the table. You knew exactly where to look. That was true. I had spent 12 years finding financial traps built by arrogant men. Grant had assumed marrying me made him immune to that skill. It only meant I had never used it against him. Until now. The meeting ended after 27 minutes. Edward called me ruthless. Sandra asked whether I had ever loved her son. That question followed me home. I poured wine I didn't drink and sat on my balcony until after midnight. Yes, I had loved him. That was the problem. Hatred would have been simpler. At 2:17 the next morning, the hospital called. Grant's condition had deteriorated. Another hemorrhage. By the time I arrived, Dr. Foster was already waiting in the corridor. There's very little more we can do surgically. Sandra covered her mouth. Edward stared at the floor. Natalie arrived 10 minutes later with Sophie asleep against her shoulder. For the first time, all of Grant's lives were standing in the same hallway, and none of us knew whether he would survive until morning.
Grant survived the night. Barely. By sunrise, Dr. Foster explained that the newest bleed had caused extensive damage. Another operation might keep his body alive, but the probability of him returning to anything resembling his previous life was extremely small. Edward asked the question none of us wanted to ask. If you were your husband, what would you do? Dr. Foster didn't answer immediately. I would ask what he would have wanted. That was the cruelest part. Grant had spent years telling different people what they wanted to hear. I had no idea what he actually wanted. Fortunately, the decision was no longer mine. Sandra and Edward had medical authority. They asked for an hour alone. Natalie sat at the opposite end of the corridor with Sophie asleep across 2 chairs, her stuffed fox tucked beneath her chin. At 8:36, Sandra came out. Her face was completely empty. We're stopping aggressive treatment. Natalie stood. What? Sandra looked at her but couldn't speak. Edward did. He isn't coming back. Natalie began shaking her head. No, you don't know that. The doctors. Doctors are wrong all the time. She walked toward Grant's room. A nurse gently blocked her. Natalie started crying, not elegantly, not quietly. She collapsed against the wall and covered her face. I watched Sophie wake up. The little girl looked around, confused by all the adults crying. Then she saw me. For some reason, she walked toward me. Where's Daddy? Every prepared sentence I had ever used in court disappeared. I crouched. He's very sick. Can I see him? I looked at Natalie. She nodded through tears. A nurse brought Sophie inside. Grant died at 3:11 that afternoon. I was not in the room. His parents were. Natalie was. Sophie was holding his hand. I was downstairs in the hospital cafe drinking coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. When Thomas called to tell me, I stared at the cup and said, okay. That was all. Not because I felt nothing, because I felt too many incompatible things at once. Grief, rage, relief, shame about the relief. And somewhere beneath all of it, the strange sadness of understanding that the person I had loved had never existed exactly as I remembered him. 7 days after Grant's death, everyone gathered in my conference room. Sandra and Edward, Natalie and her new attorney, Rebecca Shaw, Thomas, Ethan, and me. I ordered breakfast, coffee, fruit, pastries. People behave slightly better when food is present. Thomas began. Northline's liabilities, after the failed funding round and accelerated debt, were approximately $31 million. Grant's estate was personally exposed to almost $13 million, assets protected under the marital agreement, and my separate ownership totaled approximately $36 million. Natalie's settlement protected Sophie's immediate housing and education, but the hundreds of thousands transferred to Natalie over 4 years would be reviewed as marital asset transfers. The Mercer Island house was tied to the older loan. Edward interrupted. So that's it? Thomas looked at him. What do you mean? My son dies and she keeps everything? He pointed at me. I folded my hands. No. Everyone looked at me. I keep what was legally mine and what Grant voluntarily separated from his liabilities.
Edward laughed bitterly. Voluntarily? He was lying in a hospital. He was conscious, represented, and medically competent when he signed. You planned it. Yes. The room went silent. There was no reason to pretend anymore. I planned to make sure 8 years of my work did not disappear because Grant secretly financed another household while gambling with company debt. Sandra finally looked at me. We loved Sophie. I know. We didn't know how to tell you. You had 4 years. She lowered her eyes. Natalie's attorney cleared her throat. We intend to challenge portions of the transfers. Thomas slid a thick binder across the table. You're welcome to. Rebecca opened it. Her expression changed after the first few pages. Every transfer, every company, every signature, every disclosure. Grant had created the trail himself. All I had done was follow it. The meeting lasted 53 minutes. When everyone left, Natalie remained behind. She stood beside the window for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Did you hate me?" At first. And now? I looked at her. No. She nodded. I think I hate him. You won't forever. How do you know? Because eventually you'll get tired of giving him that much space in your life. She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. Sophie still asks about him every morning. That was the one victory I couldn't enjoy, because whatever Grant had been to me, to that little girl, he had simply been daddy.
The legal disputes lasted almost 3 months. Natalie hired a stronger attorney this time, someone who specialized in complex estates and corporate structures. They challenged several transfers, questioned the timing of Grant's signatures, and threatened to argue that he had lacked capacity after the accident. Thomas expected it. So did I. Every document had medical confirmation attached. Every signature had witnesses. Every agreement had been reviewed against the exact possibility they were now trying to raise. In the end, Natalie settled. She kept enough to provide Sophie with a stable home and education. The apartment was sold. The Mercedes went back. Most of the expensive jewelry Grant had given her became part of the estate recovery. She moved with Sophie to a smaller place outside Seattle. I never visited. But for a while, Owen continued sending updates. Not because I had asked him to watch them permanently, because there were still open financial issues. One report mentioned that Sophie had started kindergarten. Another noted that Natalie had returned to full-time work. Then one afternoon, Owen placed a final folder on my desk. That's everything. No more loose ends? None that matter. I closed the folder without opening it. Good. He studied me. You know, most clients would have destroyed half their house during something like this. I considered breaking a lamp. Progress. I almost smiled. Then he slid a small box across the desk. Inside was a bottle of 12-year-old whiskey. A card was taped to it. Never playing poker with you. That made me laugh. Actually laugh. It was the first time in weeks that the sound didn't feel borrowed from somebody else. Northline itself didn't survive. Not as Grant had built it. The board sold 2 divisions and dissolved most of the remaining operations. But underneath the debt, there were valuable pieces. A routing platform, several patents, 2 major shipping contracts. Under the restructuring agreements, I had the legal right to acquire certain assets through a new entity. So I did. Not because I wanted Grant's company. I didn't. I wanted the parts that still had value without the lies attached to them. Ethan joined me. So did 17 Northline employees who had spent years watching Grant take credit for their work. We called the new company Meridian Freight Technologies. No Mercer, no Northline. Nothing inherited except the useful code. 6 months later, Meridian was profitable. I remained at Donovan Pipe, although I reduced my caseload for the first time since becoming partner. 70-hour weeks became 50, then occasionally 45. It felt irresponsible at first, then wonderful. I sold the Queen Anne house. There were 2 mini rooms containing memories that had become unreliable. I bought a smaller apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The first week there, I bought a jasmine plant. The old one in our house had died because I constantly forgot to water it. This one survived. That felt embarrassingly important. Sandra Mercer called once, late November. I almost ignored it. I answered on the final ring. "You ruined us," she said. There was no greeting. "No, Sandra, our home is being sold." "I know. Edward barely sleeps."
I closed the document I had been reading. I'm sorry. No, you're not.
She was right. Not entirely. Then her voice changed. We loved you. That hurt more than the accusation. Then why didn't you tell me? Silence. Finally, she whispered, Grant said he would handle it. Of course he did. Grant had built his entire life around people believing he would handle things. And you let him? We didn't want to lose our granddaughter. So you decided losing me was easier. Sandra began crying. I listened. After a while, she asked, Do you think he loved you? I looked out at the water. Yes. That answer surprised even me. I think Grant loved people in the way he knew how. He just loved himself more. We never spoke again. For months afterward, people asked whether I regretted what I had done. The agreements, the investigation, protecting the assets, exposing Northline. My answer depended on the day. Sometimes no. Sometimes absolutely. But regret and guilt are not the same thing, and neither one changes what happened. Grant believed everyone in his life could be managed separately. His wife, his girlfriend, his parents, his investors, his employees. He thought none of us would ever compare notes. His greatest mistake wasn't the affair. It wasn't the secret child. It wasn't even the money. His greatest mistake was believing that the walls between his different lives would stand forever. All it took was one car accident to knock a door open, and once I saw what was on the other side, I never closed it again.
A year after Grant died, I received an envelope at the office. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Sophie stood in front of a school display holding a construction paper certificate. She was smiling with the kind of complete, unguarded happiness children manage before adults teach them to hide it. On the back, Natalie had written only 3 words. She is okay. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't respond. There was nothing useful left to say. By then, Meridian had grown to 40 employees. Ethan became chief operating officer, which suited him better than working beneath a man who treated competence like competition. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly numbers, he asked me something nobody else had. If Grant had survived and recovered completely, what would you have done? I looked at him. Divorced him. That's it? No. I closed the spreadsheet. I would have taken everything I was legally entitled to, exposed every hidden transfer, forced him to explain Northline's finances to the board, and made him answer every question under oath. Ethan smiled slightly. So basically what you did anyway. Almost. What would have been different? He would have had to watch. The words sounded colder aloud than they had in my head. For a moment, I regretted saying them. Then Ethan nodded. I think that's fair. I wasn't sure it was. Fairness had stopped being a useful word to me. People like simple stories. Faithful wife, cheating husband, innocent mistress, cruel parents, perfect revenge. But real lives are rarely arranged that neatly. Natalie had participated in an affair, but she had also spent years being lied to. Sandra and Edward betrayed me, but they loved their granddaughter. Grant deceived almost everyone around him, yet Sophie's memories of him were probably full of bedtime stories and pancakes and being carried when she was tired. And me? I protected myself, but I also knew exactly how frightened Natalie was when I placed those documents in front of her. I knew what pressure would do to Grant during recovery. I knew where every financial weakness was and exactly when to press it.
Anyone who tells you revenge feels clean has probably never gotten what they wanted. Sometimes winning simply means being the person left standing when everything stops moving. 2 years later, I left Donovan Pike. Not because I was tired of law, because I had become tired of spending every day inside other people's worst decisions. I kept a small advisory practice and divided the rest of my time between Meridian and painting. The paintings were terrible at first, then less terrible. Eventually, one ended up hanging in my office. Blue-gray water, a balcony, a single green plant in the corner. Rachel said it looked peaceful. I didn't tell her I had painted it at 3 a.m. The jasmine on my balcony flowered that summer. I stood outside one evening, watching the city lights appear across the water, and realized I had gone almost an entire day without thinking about Grant. Then another. Then 3. That was how it happened. Not forgiveness, not closure. Distance. The person who had occupied every room of my life slowly became someone I remembered, instead of someone I continued arguing with in my head. I never remarried. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I won't. But I stopped treating independence like evidence that something was missing. For 8 years, I believed trust meant not looking too closely. I know better now. Trust is not blindness. Trust is seeing clearly and deciding someone has earned the privilege of being believed. Grant never understood that. He thought trust was simply the space people gave him to hide things. And in the end, that was what destroyed him. Not me, not Natalie, not his parents, not Northline. Grant built a life that required everyone around him to remain in separate rooms. The accident opened the doors. I just refused to close them again. And if there is one thing I learned from everything that happened, it is this. Never underestimate the person who stops crying
starts documenting, and finally decides to look at the whole picture.